I'm delighted to have with us now Claire Melamed, who is CEO of the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. We've just had an excellent panel here at the conference talking about the importance of data. Can you explain to us why data is so important in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals?
Data has two roles that are absolutely core to the Sustainable Development Goals. Firstly, and famously, the Sustainable Development Goals have within them a set of targets and a set of quantitative indicators that tell the world whether or not we're reaching those targets. So the commitment is not just a vague commitment to make life better for everyone, but a very specific set of commitments around reducing poverty, reducing maternal mortality, improving the environment in quantifiable ways. So we need the data to know whether or not we're living up to those promises and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. But a second element is that governments and NGOs and UN agencies and others need data to know how to achieve the goals. So if you want to allocate your resources to improving maternal mortality in a particular country, you need to know where is it that women are dying? Yes. Where is it that it's underserved currently with midwives or with antibiotics or the other things that are so important? And for that, you need the kind of data that allows governments to make decisions. So data is an absolutely critical part of the infrastructure for achieving the SDGs and for then knowing whether what we're doing is working.
Yes, yes. Now, there have been 17 SDGs now and a multitude of targets beneath that. That's a huge amount of data to be collected. How successful do you think we are being at the moment in collecting that data and it being complete and timely?
Well, at the moment, there's probably, I think I'm safe to say, there's no government in the world that has all the data that they need to monitor the SDGs. And the agreement of the framework and the commitment that governments have made on behalf of their statisticians to collect all of this data has led to a certain amount of soul searching within the statistical community around what is it that they can really deliver. Yes. There's no country, as I say, that can currently deliver all of the indicators for the SDGs. And of course, this has in turn galvanized a big effort in terms of investment in data, thinking about new ways of collecting information, as well as investments in some of the kind of fundamental bedrocks of any government data system. So I think the hope and the current evidence is that the SDGs are providing incentives for governments and others to invest in their data systems.
Are there some particular sectors or some areas where you really feel that we are struggling and there should be greater attention paid to those areas?
I think there are three kinds of gaps that we probably want to talk about in terms of data for the SDGs. So the first gap is gaps in time. When we look at a number now on a page, there are a certain number of people who are below the poverty line in a given country or whatever, we kind of assume that is a number that was collected recently, yes. That's based on actual data that somebody collected either with a clipboard and pen going out to remote villages or in some other way, but usually it isn't. So for example, across the continent of Africa, when you look at a number for people below the poverty line across the whole continent of Africa, for 2/3 of those people, the actual data on which that number is based was collected before the SDGs were even agreed. Mm-hmm. Sure. Surveys are kind of hugely out of date. Now, it doesn't mean that anyone's lying to you or that the number is wildly, wildly wrong, because of course we have invested a lot in statistical methods and modelling and all the different ways that we can use old data to estimate current realities. But it would be better to just have the data. Sure, yes. And it would be better to not have to go through all of those statistical hoops and just have the up-to-date numbers. So I think that's the first gap, is in terms of time. A second gap is people. One of the commitments in the Sustainable Development Goals is to leave no one behind, and that's one of the basic principles that runs through all of the goals. Yes, yes. It's very difficult to know whether you're leaving everybody behind if you don't know where everybody was in the first place. Sure, yeah. And there are big gaps in the data that we have about people. There are some people that are simply never counted. So UNFPA, the UN's agency that's responsible, for example, for helping countries out with their census programs, estimates that in the last census, the last global census round, where all countries try to count all their people within a few years so we get a sense of the world's population, there's about 7% of the population of the world that were simply left out, that were never counted. We're just going into a new census round, so we can, this is going to be the census round that will give us the sort of understanding of who are the people who we're trying to achieve the SDGs for. So it's absolutely essential that we count everybody.
Of that 7%, are they sort of concentrated in any particular geographical regions, or are there countries who are sort of deliberately ignoring whole sort of sections of their populations? How does that work?
As ever, it's a combination of things. So there are some countries, Afghanistan, for example, where there have been decades of conflict, and clearly that makes it very, very difficult to conduct a census. So there are some whole countries that are left out. And then there are also groups of people, as you say, within countries that are sometimes uncounted, either deliberately by the government wanting to leave them out, or because those particular groups don't want to be visible in the data because they fear what might happen as a consequence of becoming more visible to a government that they see as repressive. So there are lots of different reasons why that 7% have been left out. But the critical thing is that, of course, when you do have a government that is trying to do good for its people, or an agency that's come in to try to help them, the first thing they need to know is that they exist. Yeah, sure. Nobody is going to build a hospital or a school or a road for a population that they don't know is there. So the first thing you have to do is to actually count everybody, so that you can then move on to the next step of actually understanding what it is they need and improving their lives. And that's the second big gap that we have in data, is simply whole groups of people who are left out. And then the third gap is in things. There are some aspects of people's lives that simply we don't count, or are very, very poorly measured. Sometimes those are because they're things which traditionally have been sort of outside of the remit of government. So of course the informal economy by definition is something which we don't always have a very clear picture of. People don't like asking questions about it. But on the other hand, given the importance of the informal economy to so many people's lives, better to know what's going on. Yes. And then there are other places where we've just systematically underinvested in systems. So there is a tiny proportion of the world's deaths that happen every year which are actually recorded. All the numbers that we have on deaths are, again, estimated from surveys, from asking people retrospectively about the people in their family who have died and so on. But much better to get accurate information every day of who is dying and what they're dying from. Imagine, for global health programs, the benefit that would be. So there are some sort of parts of people's lives that, for different reasons, have been just hugely underinvested in, and those are some of the gaps that we have to fill.
And I like this expression you used in the panel, the injustice of invisibility. And I think sort of really saying that this is an equity issue, really, is that, that people, if they're not being recognised, it doesn't get more inequitable than that. Can you maybe sort of explain more about that concept of the injustice of invisibility? Absolutely.
I mean, who are the people who are not counted? Of course, no surprises. It's the people who are most marginalised and who are poorest and who have least political power and who governments don't need to count. So sometimes that might be an ethnic group that governments don't want to see because it causes them political problems. Sometimes that can be a whole group of people who, for whatever reason, are simply not acknowledged as part of or whose problems and whose challenges are not acknowledged as being a kind of legitimate part of the policy conversation. So, for example, if you take physical disabilities, people have, there's a lot of hypothesis and sort of guesstimates of the number of the children who are currently out of school in the world, who are out of school because they suffer from some sort of physical disability that prevents them from going to school. Now, that's a really important question to know, because, hundreds of millions of dollars are being invested into education globally, and we need to know why kids are out of school so we spend that money well. Do we need more teachers, or do we need wheelchair ramps? Or, as is almost certainly true, a combination of the two. But often, countries, the data simply doesn't exist on the extent of physical disabilities in children because nobody's asking the question. And that's a huge injustice to those children whose problems and challenges in getting an education, which is their right, are just never going to be addressed. And so it's that sort of injustice of being invisible to those who come with resources and with decisions and with all of the architecture that we've created to try to make life better for people. If those people are simply sort of holes in the map, well, then they're never going to benefit.
Yes, yes. And turning specifically to the issue of governance in collecting data, how can the international community ensure that governments are collecting the correct data and are complying with their own SDG targets and goals? Because, governments that choose not to do this, it must be very difficult to put pressure on them. So how can the world collectively put pressure on governments to do the right thing on this?
Well, we have a number of different ways for doing that. All of them to different degrees are sort of part of the picture. So first of course, is the sort of peer pressure and the construction of a normative framework like the Sustainable Development Goals does highlight those countries that have less data or have made less investments in data. It's very visible now which countries have the data that they need to monitor the SDGs and which don't, because all countries report on that. And so there's a sort of peer pressure there in terms of countries wanting to be seen to do the right thing and wanting to be seen to be among the leaders in these international agreements. So that's one. Secondly, the UN system itself has a very sophisticated and effective architecture for governing global statistics. There is a very hard-won agreement called the Fundamental Principles of Official Statistics, which is about the ways in which statisticians should approach their job and the importance of rigor and accuracy and independence in government statistical services. And that, again, is another normative framework brokered by the UN, which can help hold governments to account. And then I think thirdly, of course, is with all of the interest and excitement around data, we hope that there will be increased amount of popular accountability. Data is something which perhaps hasn't grabbed the popular imagination, probably never will, in contrast with the big issues like health and education that are really a matter of life and death. But I think increasingly people do understand that data is an important way of telling the story of their society, and that they themselves want to be sort of well reflected in that story in a way which reflects their own lives. So data systems are under more scrutiny for their inclusiveness, for their accuracy. And of course, also with all of the new sources of data, with satellites, with mobile phones, we're again quite rightly thinking really from scratch how to create the global systems for governing, for regulating those sources of data and making sure they're used to help people, as we know they can be, and not to harm people, as we also know they could be. So I think there's, as always, a number of different legs to the global governance for data, and different groups, governments, the UN, other kinds of agencies all have a part to play.